friends, it's Christy. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be making a card using the Mama Elephant You Raise Me Up stamp set. And I'm going to be coloring with my Copic markers to match some paper from the Simple Stories Boho Baby 6x8 pad. So I'm going to tear out a piece of pattern paper and tuck that under my cardstock panel so that I can pull my color palette from there. As usual, I stamped out my images with Lawn Fawn Jet Black ink on Spectrum Noir Ultra Smooth Premium White cardstock, which is my favorite cardstock for Copic coloring. So I'm going to jump right in with the little bear, and I'm going to do him in E31, E33, E35, and E37. So I'm trying to pull out that darker brown stripe in that pattern paper. So I'm going to start with my E37, that's going to be my darkest shade. So I'm going to lay in my shadows on the sides of his body, a little bit between his legs, kind of emphasizing the curve of his feet that are jutting out. And then also I put it on the top of his arm that his head is resting on, because his head would be casting a shadow on that. And then just outlining the edges of his face to make him look nice and round and chubby. And then I'm going to come in with my next shade, the E35, and begin to blend that out. Just tracing over the edge of the E37 and pulling that color into the next shade so I get a nice smooth blend. So I'm going to continue working my way around this adorable little bear. I think this stack of animals is just so super cute. There's another stack in this set. I'll use that later on the inside of the card, but I can't wait to use it on the front of a card in another video. So now I'm coming in with what would normally be my lightest shade, but I'm going to pull in a fourth shade for this guy here today. So I'm using E33 now to blend that out. And sometimes I only use 3 shades. It just really depends on the tones of the markers, because I like a lot of contrast in my coloring. So I want to make sure I go from a fairly dark shade to a fairly light shade. And with these E30s, I just felt like these 4 markers made that transition the best. And also he is the largest of all of these critters. He is a pretty large image, so having that 4th shade in there, it just really adds something. And you could definitely skip the E31 if you wanted to, but I think having that lighter shade in there just really makes him look extra dynamic, and it also keeps his face nice and light, which makes the features more visible, which I think is essential. You know, when you're coloring with critters, you really want that face to show. So now I'm moving on to the fox, and I'm using my go-to fox combo, which is YR12, YR14, and YR18. So I am shading with that YR18 first, doing my shadows on the bottom of his body, up where that bear's arm would be casting a shadow on his hindquarters, where his tail is tucked behind the front of his body there, and then along the sides of his face as well, blending out with that YR14. And then I'm going to come in with that lightest shade, the YR12, and just fill in any remaining white space except for his tail, his belly, his paws, and the lower part of his face and neck. Those are going to be in a contrasting color. So while I have those markers out, I am using that YR18 to color in the bird's beaks. And then I'm moving on to E50 and E51 to add just a little bit of like a beige or cream color to the fox's white fur. So I'm adding just a little bit of that E51 for a shadow. I'm going to blend that out with the E50 and then let that fade into the white for the highlight. And then I'm also going to use those shades on the hedgehog skin, but this time I'm going to color him in completely. Well, I left a little white spot on the very tip of his nose, but I did go back in with a second layer to increase that saturation on him, so he looks different than the whites of the fox. Then I'm moving on to E43, E44, and E47. I'm using the E47 to color in the bear and fox's noses, and then I'll use all 3 shades for the hedgehog's spikes. So I'm using that E47 first and just doing little kind of dash lines, and then I'm going to come in with the E44 next and scatter some of those in there as well, and then a little bit of that E43 to just fill in the rest of that. And then I realized I missed his foot, so I just went back to the E51 and colored that in completely. Next I'm going to do the bunny, and I decided to go with cool grays because the cool grays kind of lend themselves to that blue-gray stripe that's in the pattern paper. It's not going to be as blue as that stripe, but it still kind of ties it in a bit. So I chose C0, C1, and C3, laid in some shadow with the C3, not too much because I didn't want him to get really dark, just a very soft gray bunny. Blended that out with the C1 and then used the C0. Again, I left a little bit of white space on the face. And then I'm going to work on the red squirrel. Red squirrels are my favorite, so I'm tying in that lighter reddish brown stripe in the pattern paper with this combo using E13, E17, and E18. So I'm using the E18 to do some shadows now, especially in the curve of his tail and then along the back of his body. Where his little front arm is kind of tucked away toward the side, and then blending that out with the E17, and then I'm going to come in with the E13 and fill in the rest of that white space except for the area around his eye. I'll do that in a different shade in just a minute, but I'm just making sure to really pull the edge of that E17 in with the E13. Because they are a little bit far apart. That E13 is quite a bit lighter, so it does push the E17 away a bit. So just keep that in mind. Sometimes a second layer will help with that, but he wasn't too bad for this one. I used E11 to go over his eye, and now for the birds, I'm also going to pull back in to that kind of bluish gray stripe in that pattern paper with B41 and B45. So I'm using the B45 for the shadows down the backs of their bodies and then a little on their wings and tails. And since one is facing right and one is facing left, I did flip the shadows so it's consistent with the highlight on the face. And then I blended that out with the B41. And then to soften that a bit, I pulled in the B quadruple 0 to finish the face and the breast of the bird. And then while I have these colors out, I'm also going to use them to accent my clouds. So I'm going to start with the lightest shade, the B quadruple 0, and I'm just following the curves of the bottom swirls and then the top little drawn in swirl as well. And just seeing how I like that, I'm going to build up my color. I did decide that I needed to darken that a bit, so I pulled in B triple 0. And I wanted to darken that up a little bit more, but I felt like the B41 was a little too dark. So instead I grabbed the B52 and I'm going to add just a touch of that in there. And since that paper is really saturated from laying in the other 2 shades already, I'm not going to even bother blending that back out. The colors are just going to kind of meld together on their own. For the flag, I wanted to pull in that golden yellow stripe, so I went with Y11, Y13, and Y15. I'm adding some shading to either end and then also a shadow down the center where that fabric dips a bit so that it really looks like it's kind of folded in the wind. So blending that Y15 out with the Y13 and then using the Y11 for the highlight. And then to tie in that pink stripe in the pattern paper, I'm going to give all of my critters some rosy cheeks and also color the insides of some of their ears. So I'm going to use R000, R11, and R20. Using the R20 first to lay in a little oval on each of the cheeks, and then I'll trace around that with the R11. Now some of the critters are lighter than others, so for the ones that are darker, I don't need the R000. It's going to stand up just fine on those darker colors, but on the lighter ones, I do have to blend that out with the R just to soften it. And then I'm going to grab a black Sakura Jelly Roll pen and just go over the eyes of all of my critters. This just makes them bright and shiny again, so it just kind of adds a little bit of life to them. It's an extra step, but I really like doing that. And then I'm going to trim these images out with their matching dies. For my background, I've taken the second largest of the Lawn Fawn large mini slimline stackables, and that's going to be my focal panel. I want to dress that up though with some Distress Oxide ink, so I'm coming in with some Stormy Sky first and blending that around the edges and pulling that color toward the center. And then I'm going to soften that in the center with some Tumbled Glass. So it'll be darker on the outside edges and lighter in the middle. I'm going back to that Stormy Sky and darkening up the edges again and just working my way back and forth until I'm happy with how it looks. Then I'm going to grab the MFT Drifts and Hills stencil, and I'm going to mask off the top part of the sky, so I just have the grass at the bottom, and I'm going to come in with some Bundled Sage Distress Oxide ink for that. And I'm just making sure to keep that background fairly soft to match the soft colors in this pattern paper. So now I'm going to press some of those inks onto an acrylic block, the two shades that I use for the sky. I'm going to mask off the bottom this time. Then I'll splatter those inks all across that sky, so it just gives it a little bit more interest and movement on that otherwise plain background. So I mixed up both of those shades, and I'm just tapping the paintbrush off the edge so I get a really fine splatter. I don't want any big drops for this. So I had to add a little bit of extra water to that to make the Stormy Sky a little more fluid. And then I'm going to remove that mask. There you can see how the top looks. I actually set that aside to dry, and then once it was dry enough that I could put that stencil back over the top portion and without smearing it, then I can do a little splatter on the bottom with that Bundled Sage so that the whole thing is consistent. So I'm going to set that aside to finish drying, and now I'll work on my sentiment. I'm using a piece of Lawn Fawn ground coffee cardstock, and I'm treating that with my Rabbit Hole Designs powder tool because I want to heat emboss on this, and that just helps eliminate any static cling so that the embossing powder only sticks where you want it to. So I'm stamping that sentiment with some Versamark ink. It's just a clear sticky ink that works great for heat embossing, and I'm doing the one that says "Thank you for being there for me." I stamped that down twice to make sure I had a really good impression, and then I'm going to coat that with some white embossing powder. So I'll make sure that that is covered completely and then tap off any excess from the back. And then I can bring my heat gun to that. I like to heat it off to the side for about 30 seconds, and then I usually bring it to the back first and then to the front to eliminate any warping, and just heat that until that embossing powder is melted and white and shiny. I'm also going to stamp on the inside of my card, and I'm using a piece of Lawn Fawn apricot cardstock and Peachy Keen ink. And like I said, I'm going to stamp out the other animal stack in this stamp set, and then another one of the sentiments that says, "You raise me up to more than I can be." And I stamped that down a couple of times to make sure it was very visible. Then I'm going to go back to that Simple Stories Boho Baby pattern paper pad and flip through that and pick out a couple more patterns that I want to go along with that stripe background. So this one is really, really great. It has lots of options. There are so many great patterns that work well together. I decided to pull out this blue like star print, and then I actually decided that I wanted a third print, so I went back and forth but ultimately decided on this kind of rusty brown gingham. So those are the 3 patterns that I'm going to be using. I think those will tie in nicely to the coloring we've already done. So I trimmed all of those down with different Lawn Fawn dies. I used the large stitch rectangle stackables for the stripe. I used the largest of the large mini slimline stackables for the star paper, and then used that large stitch rectangle stackables to make it the same size as the card. And then I also used the stitched scallop borders on that rusty brown gingham. So I'm going to start laying down these layers with some Barely Art Precision Craft Glue. The stripe print is going to cover the entire front of the card. So I'm just making sure that is lined up with all 4 corners and smoothing that down into place. And then the gingham print is going to go behind the star print. So I'm just using my grid mat to make sure that that is lined up nice and straight. The gingham piece is slightly shorter on purpose. I just wanted those kind of scallops to end where they end naturally and not in the middle of a scallop. So I'm going to add some glue to the back of that whole piece, and then I'm going to put that down toward the left hand side of the card. I want a little bit of that striped pattern paper showing on the left and then more of it showing on the right. I've added some foam tape to the back of that focal panel so that it'll give it a little bit of lift on the card. I'm going to center that on the star print and press that down into place, and then I can bring in my images. So I'm going to start with the large animal stack since that's going to take up the majority of that background. And I'm going to kind of get that situated where I want it, but I'm not going to press it down too firmly just yet because I want to be able to tuck these clouds behind. So I'm going to just take those 3 and kind of stagger them down, kind of zigzagging to the left and then the right, and then to the left again. And just tucking them under any critters where they need to be. And then I have that extra tiny bird, and I'm going to put him so that he's perched on the fox's tail. So I'm just kind of lifting that up and tucking that under. And then I have the sentiment, which I have trimmed down with the everyday sentiment banners from Lawn Fawn. And I've added some foam tape to the part that is going to be hanging over the rest of the card. And then I'm going to just use some liquid glue for the part that is over the focal panel. So I just tore a little bit of that foam tape off so that it would be a little bit shorter, just to get that exactly where I want it, because it is going to have to cover up the bear just a little bit, but I didn't want to cover up more than I had to. So just kind of figuring out exactly where that needs to go and then pressing that down into place. To finish up this card, I'm going to grab a white Sakura Jelly Roll pen and just add a little extra detail to that hedgehog's spikes. And then I also wanted to add just a little bit of sparkle, not too much. So I'm just going to follow the coloring that I did on the clouds. So the 3 bottom kind of swoops and then the curly Q at the top. And then I did add a little bit to the bunny's tail as well. And I forgot to color in the ears of my animals, so I'm using a little R11 and then that R000 for the bunny, and then use the R000 on the fox and the bear for their ears and also on his paw. And that is going to finish up this card. So there you can see all of that sparkle and another peek at the inside. I really hope you guys enjoyed this one. I had so much fun playing with this adorable stamp set. If you did like it, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Ring that notification bell so you never miss any videos. I post new ones every Monday and Friday. I'll have all of the products I use listed and linked in the description bar below if you'd like to check them out. And if you'd like to keep watching, here are 2 extra videos I thought might also interest you. You can click on either one to check them out. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you have an absolutely amazing day. Bye-bye.